Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to open this special event titled Strategic Autonomy and the Transformation of European Union. I am Mika Aaltola, Director of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and I would like to thank the co-organizers, Jacques Delors Center and Egmont Institute, on coming together and pulling off this event this afternoon. The topic is very acute from multiple different perspectives. Different qualifiers of sovereignty, such as autonomy, have become buzzwords lately. They indicate something concerning the political and geopolitical environment that we are all living in today's world. Confusion, complexity, ambiguity prevail, while still the fabric of crisscrossing interdependencies are still in paramount position. This increasingly complex and competitive international environment is pushing the European Union and its member states to rethink some foundation stones of the Union's economic, foreign and security policy. It is at this conjunction I try to be as brief and concise and vague as possible, in order to allow the real experts to have their word on the topic. But I have to say that one key part of this event today is that it also marks the launching of FIA report, Strategic Autonomy and the Transformation of the EU, New Agendas for Security, Diplomacy, Trade and Technology. It is a fruit of our FIA project on European strategic autonomy in geo-economic world, led by Niklas Hellvik. I had the privilege of reviewing the report, and I have to say that it is a must-read for all the people who are interested and who wouldn't be on the European strategic autonomy. Next, I will introduce the chair, the moderator of the event. It's a pleasure. Tanya Latisi is taking the lead in taking us deeper into the conversation today. She is currently a policy analyst on security and defense in European Parliamentary Research Service, in a way FIA's sister institute. It is an in-house think tank of the European Parliament. She has a great publication record on matters related to EU security, defense policy, as well as transatlantic relations. She has worked in NATO Parliamentary Assembly and Transatlantic Relations Division of the European External Action Service. Currently, she is also Associate Fellow with the Egmont Royal Institute for International Relations and a member of Women in International Security, Brussels, and an associate expert at the New Strategy Center. So, Tanya, the team's floor is all yours now.
Thank you very much for the floor and for the very generous introduction. Hope I didn't bore everyone already with all my hats. And thank you, first of all, for offering me the pleasure of moderating this really wonderful event with such a stellar panel. So we have gathered here today in front of our screens, in front of our laptops, next to our coffees. I join you on this one to talk about a topic that, as has been said, has really captured the spotlight of the EU policy wonk debate, if you will, strategic autonomy. So this debate is really very wonderfully captured as well by a very rich report that FIA has launched today, and with which I happily spent a very entertaining Sunday afternoon last weekend. Today, as this report was launched, we are going to hear from several of the analysts that contributed to it, and we'll discuss strategic autonomy from different perspectives. So we'll also get a little bit of an insider's view on how strategic autonomy and some of the points that the report touches upon are seen from the engine of the European Union, so from inside the EU. Now, before handing over the floor to our speakers, let me just mention that, of course, there's going to be a Q&A after their interventions, and you'll get the chance to pose your questions. Please don't make them easy. And please also state your affiliation as per FIA instructions when you pose your question. I will then collect them and use my very extensive powers as a moderator to pose them to our speakers. And if you want to make my job as moderator and multitasker easier, you will already think about your questions and pose them early on. No need to wait until the very end. So now, without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Niklas Helvig, who is a leading researcher, not a bad title, at FIA, focusing on EU and Germany's foreign and security policy, as well as transatlantic security. So he's going to introduce to you the main findings of the report for the next minutes. Niklas, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tanya, for this introduction and for already setting the scene a little bit on the European strategic autonomy debate there. Yeah, leading researchers, funny. They introduced this title because you actually lead a project, and this was the project I was leading for the last year on European strategic autonomy, and where we today luckily and finally were able to present our report. And let me first thank all of the contributors and authors that contributed to that. Nicole and Tobias, they will speak later, but there are also other contributors, and there are also other project team members that gave their feedback in several workshops that we had last year. And you should also check out, if you have time, the front page of our FIA website, because there you find some other applications related to strategic autonomy from some of our colleagues in the project. So this is not the only outcome of this project that I had the privilege of leading in the last year. So we started with the project just before the COVID-19 pandemic, and we didn't know at that time that the pandemic would raise actually the attention and the attention on the question of strategic autonomy much more in the way that it did actually. And this is the first point I want to make. As a consequence of the pandemic that also accelerated many of the disruptive trends in international politics that we see today, the debate on European strategic autonomy has taken on really a new relevance, and it's also here to stay. I mean, 30 years ago, when we talked about strategic autonomy, it was really a narrow field. Think about the St. Malo summit, for example, that launched the Common Security and Defense Policy. It was really about military capabilities, crisis management capabilities, and the question how Europeans should organize their security and defense if behind the possibility of a retreat from the US, from Europe in the Cold War context. But since then, we come a long way, and today the strategic autonomy concept is much broader, much more global in nature. And that is also because there are completely different drivers today that we are seeing. The EU is thinking about its capacity to act because of the intensifying competition between China and the US that really affects global politics and global supply chains and markets. It's because of the breakneck speed of the technological transformation that affects our industries as well as our societies, and because global interdependencies, economic interdependencies, are not neutral anymore. They are not caring anymore. They are not the safety net anymore, but they are used by big powers to further their geostrategic goals as well. And we call this in the report leveraged interdependence. Think about, for example, the US extraterritorial sanctions in relation to the Iran nuclear deal. So as a consequence, today, interdependence carries a lot of risks as well, and not only opportunities. And strategic autonomy is really about how can we manage interdependencies, our interdependencies with the wider world better in a more efficient way. And that goes across policy fields. And in our report, we look at defense policy, we look at diplomacy, trade and investment, as well as technology. The second point I want to make is that it's not a question anymore whether we want to be strategic autonomous or not, but it's more the question of how we can actually achieve strategic autonomy. It's more about the how and not the if, so to say. And an important point that we make in the report is that autonomy is not only advanced through protectionism. It's not only about isolating yourself. It's not only about decoupling from the rest of the world. And instead, we define three approaches to strategic autonomy in the beginning of the report. So one is autonomy through protection. That is one element, but it's not the whole question. But of course, it is a certain element of the discussion. Where do we have to be protectionist in a very targeted way? How do we build up strategic capacities to identify critical sectors in which we maybe need to protect supply chains? And to what extent maybe do we want to use trade instruments to protect our values? For instance, in connection with the climate change agenda and the carbon border adjustment tax, are trade instruments a way to advance values, to protect our values? So this protectionist question is in there, but it's not the whole story. Strategic autonomy can also be advanced by supporting our economic and political foundation at home in the EU. And that we call in the report autonomy through provision. Think about, for example, the rescue package related to the COVID-19 crisis that hopefully the Finnish parliament will also pass, because there is some political turmoil here in Finland, but that's a different story. And finally, strategic autonomy is also about projection of our interests and values abroad. So it's about the EU shaping the international environment in a way that it's supportive of our interests and values. There you can, for example, think about the EU's efforts in reforming the WTO. So all of these elements, protection, provision, projection, they all form an important part in advancing strategic autonomy. But there are also tensions between those different goals, and there are policy choices to be made. And I think that is also important to highlight. Just one example, because we have Monsieur Arbon from the Commission here. One example are the EU defense industrial policies. So there's a clear, when we look at defense policies, there's a clear emphasis on autonomy through provision in the moment. One example is the European Defence Fund and how it supports research and development in the European defense industries. And that is generally seen as positive. But there are also discussions and debates around some of the protectionist elements in the defense policy. For example, Finland and Sweden have been very outspoken and supportive of third-party participation within the permanent structured cooperation. To what extent the EU outsiders can participate in the European Defence Fund is a more complicated story. There are different issues connected with that, but that is also part of the debate. So how much protectionist elements are also in some of these defense initiatives is a question. So, and then to what extent the defense initiatives support the ability to project and our values and interests internationally, that is still also hotly debated. Proponents of EU defense policy cooperation, they say that with the help of these initiatives, we will be, in the long run, be more efficient in securing our neighborhood. We will be better partners with the US in the future because we create better capabilities. But there are also skeptics that highlight that these EU defense initiatives might undermine the close defense industrial ties that some member states have with the United States, which are also in support of our security. So there are arguments and debates, and that is the general point I want to make here. In each of these policy fields that we look at, there are certain trade-offs and policy decisions and hard choices to be made in the pursuit of strategic autonomy. Yeah, so we also make some recommendations in the report, and you can find them at the beginning of each of the chapters. And obviously, I can't go through everything. In the beginning, we give some high-level recommendations, so to say. And there we were maybe a bit creative. Some of you might remember that Josep Borrell, the High Representative of the EU, last year promoted his Sinatra doctrine. My way should be the motto of the European Union. So we thought, hey, that's a great chance to promote a little bit our own music interests. So you find a couple of our own doctrines here. I personally put in the Oasis doctrine, but one I want to highlight here is the Elvis doctrine. A little less conversation, a little more action. So what we want to say by this is that there's still a fair amount of less controversial homework to be done that in itself will bring the EU forward on some of these issues. And I think Nicole and Tobias will probably address later in their interventions some issues, some concrete initiatives that are discussed in the field of trade and in the field of defense policy. But let me just add, because we have no one representing the technology part, technology was really an important discussion in our report. And you find the discussion of technological autonomy actually in all of the chapters in some way or form. And it seems that making progress on technological autonomy is a very important point. Yeah? And so one specific action that we propose there, it's on the radar, of course, of the Commission already, but it's really about bringing the transatlantic technological alliance forward and fast-tracking this somehow. The EU made already the proposal to the US administration to set up a technological and trade council, but we're still waiting to hear how this will further develop. But the EU's ability to protect its norms in this technological transformation is really at the center of this strategic autonomy debate, and that we try to highlight as well in the report. But yeah, so those were my initial points, and I really look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you very much, Niklas, for this very comprehensive outline, which really sets the stage for our debate today and puts into political context these three forms of autonomy that the report identifies: protection, provision, and projection. I dare you to try to say these 3 times fast. But now that everyone really got the ultimate teaser to go and read the report on the FIA website, and also we all just got an Elvis earworm from you, Niklas, so thank you for that. But next we're going to hear how all of these issues and the wider theme of strategic autonomy are viewed inside the Commission from someone who has really a number of impressive posts in the EU administration under his belt. So our next speaker is François Arbeau, who currently is the Director for Defense Industry at the European Commission, dealing with all these super interesting European defense topics that me and others present here love to talk about. So François, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tanya, and thank you for having me here. That's a pleasure. Indeed, I looked up with great interest in the report, and I think that I like very much what you said at the beginning, that indeed we should rather concentrate on the how. I think we have to indeed think on the how rather than to the whether or the why. And I think if you honestly answer the why, I think the whether is water under the bridge. Indeed, we have to concentrate on how to actually make sure that we develop our strategic autonomy. And again, I don't want to dwell on all the conceptual debate around that. I think that there are a number of very good reasons which we are all aware that plays in favor of the EU giving itself, let's say, a stronger capacity of autonomous action, and of course without any prejudice to the ambition to act with all the like-minded whenever possible. But I think it's always better to be able to make autonomous decisions on the basis of information that you gather on your own, autonomously, and that's so that you keep that freedom of action. So the question is the how. And I think there are two absolutely important dimensions. I would say there is a kind of more offensive dimension, which which amounts to how to create the conditions of a greater, let's say, collective determination of the Europeans and of the member states to indeed join forces, efforts to actually strengthen the European defense technological and industrial base. And I think that's a key element that we have to keep in mind. There is also a kind of more protective dimension of the strategic autonomy, which is how we can actually make sure that we identify and minimize potential dependencies. Of course, if you want to be autonomous, you have to be sure that that you can actually deploy a number of means, rely on a number of technologies without having to ask the questions of those who are actually countering that. I mean, you don't want to have to ask the questions to your potential enemies and possibly also not necessarily to your like-minded, because they can be very different situations. So when it comes to the offensive dimension, I think the EDF is of course a major breakthrough, because for the first time we have a collective, let's say, a display of ambition to allocate a significant sum of the EU budget to a collective effort to develop the industrial cooperation. And I think that's absolutely essential, and I would like to focus on that. As you've seen also, the Commission is really, let's say, accelerating its efforts to also work on the protective dimension, as I said, by displaying an ambition to work on the mapping of critical technologies, identifying the dependencies, and actually acting on them in terms of investment on where we need that investment to take place. But I would like to focus for a few minutes that I have left on this question of the EDF and how to actually create what we call this affectio societatis between the member states. I think that's the essential element. That's the key of the answer to the question: how can we actually develop that strategic autonomy? For the first time, we have 8 billion from the EU budget to be spent on a collective effort. But now we have to create the conditions of that motivation, that collective understanding that this is indeed a necessity to develop that cross-border cooperation. I think the primary reasons why it makes sense to cooperate are absolutely obvious. I mean, of course, you mutualize basically your investment capacity. So you have more money because no member state is able actually to develop that effort, alone. In any case, even if we had the means, that would be inefficient. So mutualization is of the essence. I think there is also an intrinsic value in confronting cultures, because innovation, which is of course what we are looking for, is actually emerging from the confrontation of different cultures, of innovation, of industry. So this is very much needed. A key element of strategic autonomy, and that's why I call it the offensive dimension of it, is of course to be able to stay ahead of the curve. So there is a huge, competitive dimension of our industry to it, and so this is about staying ahead of the curve in terms of innovation. And for that, we need more means. And also, we need to broaden the scope, basically, of our collective efforts, because we see that the innovation on which defense capacities have to rely upon are, let's say, very much broader than it used to be the case. You can no longer carve out, let's say, the defense sector in terms of specific innovation needs. The innovation actually is coming from the civil sector, from the space sector, so there is a kind of unification. And I think that in regard of the need to actually demonstrate that member states have a collective interest to strengthen their ambition, I think the fact that we see let's say a unification of threats, this is not the matter of the day, but let's say that the hybridization of the different threats is a situation that we witness every day. I think that indeed there is a convergence of all the technologies, as I said already, and those two elements mean that let's say the sheer need of deploying a greater ambition is something that becomes a tangible reality for every single member state, and not only for some member states which already and historically consent, let's say, a very, very strong effort in research innovation in the field of defense. So I'm saying that because, and I will finish with that, because when it comes to that very challenging, basically, mission of creating that Affexio Societatis, we should actually build on the fact that indeed hybridization, unification of technologies mean that every member states will see better into what they can contribute to that collective effort. Because the challenge in the EDF is that there is 8 billion of EU budget to be spent, but of course we know that traditionally let's say the big industries in the sector of defense are not evenly distributed amongst the member states, and so there is a culture of, let's say, research and innovation in the sector of defense. There are other member states who are more, off the shelf, let's say, acquirers. So how can we create that Affexio Societatis? That's absolutely key. And the EDF is there to demonstrate that basically the increase in the effort can be meaningful for every single member state. I think if we want to succeed in our effort, the plan is to make sure that at the end of the MFF cycle, every member state agrees on the fact that we have to actually continue the experience, possibly enhance it, because every member state, every industry, irrespective of its structure and positioning, every member state has made the tangible experience that they tangibly contributed to the collective effort, and that also that they benefited, of course, from that collective endeavor. So the EDF will actually knit together, the member states by project by project, creating those famous solidarité de fait, if I can refer to Schuman, so that it becomes more of a reflex, basically, to say, yes, we have everything to gain in joining forces, because, for instance, as innovation is coming more from non-traditional players, every single member state has, the mid-caps, the SMEs, that are really, at the top of the edge in certain sectors, and therefore can contribute to basically a more thriving EDTIB. That's one thing. On the resilience aspect, and I'll stop here because I'm too long already, but very well that we have new measures in place. We have the Synergies Action Plan, the Observatory of Critical Technologies that is being ramped up. We have the European Council has tasked the Commission to come up with a technology roadmap by October this year. So I spare you all the details because you will know where to find it. But let's say that we act on those two legs, the offensive dimension of it and the more protective. But I can only insist on the need for the EDF to demonstrate basically that every member state can really tangibly contribute if we are really deploying together new projects which are very inclusive by nature, but also that are very meaningful in terms of what we actually supply in terms of equipment to the armed forces. But I will stop here, and sorry if I was a bit too long already.
No, merci beaucoup, François. It's really very valuable to hear from you, especially since you really see firsthand how the sausage of European defense is made. So that was very useful. So now, after getting this sort of reality check from the Commission side, I have the really utmost pleasure of introducing our next speaker, who wrote an excellent chapter in this report focusing on the defense dimension of strategic autonomy. So on this, we're going to hear from Nicole Koenig, who is a deputy director at the Jacques Delors Center in Berlin, and who is a foremost expert on everything EU foreign and security policy, the EU's institutional labyrinth and migration policy. So in your chapter, Nicole, you diagnose that on the one hand, there's this gap between ambition and reality that reduces the credibility of essentially any EU strategic autonomy in defense. And that on the other hand, there are also these diverging strategic cultures that are among the key obstacles to achieving this autonomy. And these are also issues that François also pointed out. He said that we need to broaden the scope of our collective efforts and create this solidarity reflex. So I look forward to hearing your insights on how we can reduce these gaps and how do you see the ongoing strategic compass process playing out. And let me also remind already the audience to feel free to already pose your questions inside the chat. Thank you, Nicole, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tanya. I hope you can all hear me. Welcome also on behalf of the Jacques Delors Center. And thank you very much to FIA and Egmont for co-hosting this event. And I guess my special thanks here really goes to Niklas, who as a lead researcher did an excellent job in bringing us all together and keeping us on track for this report. Now, Tanja, as you mentioned, so I had a look in my chapter at the defense dimension, and this defense dimension is very much the narrow concept of strategic autonomy. It's the more traditional dimension of strategic autonomy. And I think you see a bit of a paradox. On the one hand, it's also this dimension where it is actually an agreed objective. It's also an overarching objective of the EU global strategy. But as you said, Tanja, it's also the area where it's still very much, it's the most sensitive dimension of strategic autonomy, I would argue, and the most contested one, and also still the one where the gap between ambition and reality, as you said, is wide. And what I did in my chapter is to go through 3 dimensions of strategic autonomy and to really look at developments since 2016 to see a little bit what has happened in these dimensions and what hasn't happened. So I'll briefly take you through these 3 dimensions and then go into recommendations. Now, first of all, the first dimension is the political dimension of strategic autonomy. And the way that I define that is that we really need a joint vision, a joint understanding of strategic autonomy, of what that means and what the appropriate degree is. And as you said, Tanja, I think what I argue in my chapter is that here the key obstacle is still the different strategic cultures and the different threat perceptions of the member states. So one of the most controversial question that strategic autonomy raises is always this question, strategic autonomy from whom? And I think this question is very much tied to NATO, it's very much tied to the US, and therefore it divides Europeanists and Atlanticists in the EU. And I think if we look back to the past years, we could see that the Trump administration and also Brexit were drivers behind strategic autonomy, not least because both actually strengthened the Atlanticist camp. Then came the Biden victory, and then we had this debate that you will remember on whether strategic autonomy is actually an illusion or whether it's an imperative. We had this debate between Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer and Macron, and we had this fear that we are shifting, that the center of gravity is shifting back to the Atlanticist camp, and that the efforts behind strategic autonomy in defense are actually losing steam. Then we move to this question that the others have mentioned, the strategic autonomy, how, for what, to do what. And here I think this is where different threat perceptions come in. So for what? Strategic autonomy for dealing with crises in the neighborhood? Is it more the East? Is it more the West? Should the EU be a regional security player? Should it be a global security player? Are we looking at traditional, conventional threats, or are we looking at newer threats? We heard about the hybridization of threats, the implications of disruptive technology, the issue that is always on the table now is this access to the global commons. So which kind of threats? Strategic autonomy for what? And here we still have divisions. And finally, again, connected to strategic cultures, strategic autonomy to do what? So how do we respond to these threats? And here we have these traditional lines between allied and non-aligned member states, between more interventionist and more pacifist member states, between more activist, between more restrained member states. So these are the divides that stand in the way of coming together on a common understanding of what strategic autonomy means. And the global strategy of 2016 did not really do so much to bridge these divides. So it said that, yes, there should be an appropriate degree of strategic autonomy, but it's still a bit unclear what that means. And to take just one example, looking at the different threats that are in the strategy, it's an extremely broad spectrum, but there are no very clear priorities. Now, that much for the political dimension, which I think is the most important one. The second dimension is this institutional dimension. So do we have the decision-making structures and the institutions to implement strategic autonomy, to implement this common vision? And here I think since 2016, we have seen a lot of incremental progress. We have, but also a legal ceiling in a way. So we have seen that there was a debate on extending qualified majority voting, but this debate did not really touch on the military or defense dimension, and generally did not make a lot of progress. And then we had, for example, incremental steps towards an EU headquarters with a military planning and conduct capability, also because of Brexit and also broadening mandate here. And we have seen, as Mr. Abbo also illustrated very well, a growing role of the Commission in the field of the defense industry with the European Defence Fund. In a way, also stretching a little bit the legal boundaries by bringing this defense fund into the MFF and focusing on this industrial side. But at the same time, in this institutional dimension, we still also have different perspectives of the member states, and I think we saw that very much when it came to PESCO and this debate between France and Germany, where Germany was very keen on having an inclusive PESCO, whereas France was very focused on the operational dimension and also on this aspect of flexibility. And what we also see in terms of projection of strategic autonomy is that we also see a growing number of rather coalitions of the willing, also European coalitions of the willing, rather than bigger EU missions. And finally, the third dimension is this material dimension. So if you have a common vision, if you have the institutions, you also, of course, need the means. And again, the initiatives since 2016 have, I think, very much focused on this material dimension. And we have heard all the developments that Mr. Abbo described. But still, if we look at the recent CARD report, we can still say that it's actually not enough. So the impact of these new initiatives is there, but it's still limited. So, for example, the findings of this CARD report were not yet included in national defense planning. There is still too little investment in research and technology on the side of the member states, and the outlook is not very promising. There is still not enough collaborative spending in the field of defense. And yes, we have the European Defence Fund, but let's not forget that also the ambition was lowered compared to the initial Commission proposal by almost 40% in terms of the volume. And at the same time, we are in the context of a global pandemic, and the outlook on national defense spending is still rather uncertain. So what we face is really a growing set of requirements, a hybridization of threats, a 300-degree threat analysis that we have that illustrates this breadth. But at the same time, this growing number of requirements means that even if we continue with the same amount of spending, that the EU could easily be overstretched. So moving to the recommendations. So first of all, I agree very much with what Mr. Abbo said, that it's important to move away from conceptual debates. So in the field of defense in particular, strategic autonomy is an agreed objective. And the question is not so much from whom we are independent, but more for what, and what do we want to be able to do autonomously if we have to. And I think this is the key question for the strategic compass. And I think what should happen here, I mean, we're now in the process where the member states are discussing. The final product should be published in March next year. And I think what's important here is to have a more concrete level of ambition in terms of EU crisis management. So to really discuss political criteria, what we want to be able to achieve in a case where perhaps the US or NATO are not interested. And the second is this whole area, broader area of access to the global commons. And I think here it will be also important to define what is actually a common area, or what are common areas of European interests. So do we focus on maritime presences? What do we want to be able to do in terms of securing the airspace? What should be our cyber capacity and so on? So to have a clearer vision of that. I think in terms of institutional autonomy, qualified majority voting will not be in the cards in the military domain for a long time, I think. So what I think here the next step should be to really upgrade the EU's integrated approach. And I think here both at headquarters level and on the ground. And in terms of the headquarters level, I think there still could be some steps towards strengthening the civil-military dimension of planning and also the civil-military dimension of the MPCC cooperation with the CPCC, so Civilian Military Crisis Management. And another step, in addition to this integrated approach, is to think about how we can bring together flexible coalitions of the willing and the EU framework. So here, I think it would be good to explore the implementation of Article 44. So to really think about situations where we could bring a coalition of the willing, a European coalition of the willing, into the EU framework, and what kind of incentives would be needed for this coalition of the willing to move into the EU framework, and for the other EU member states to get on board. And then finally, on material autonomy, I think Mr. Abo already mentioned or explained it very well. I think it's still the key question will be how to maximize the benefits of the EU mechanisms. I think we need a closer match between the operational scenarios that will be developed by the Strategic Compass, the next CARD review, the European Defence Fund, and also the PESCO projects, so that there is a closer match. And I think the other point that Mr. Abo has also mentioned is, because we are facing this broadening amount of threats, and the resources at the EU level are simply limited, I think it's very important to use these synergies between defense, space, and civilian industries. And I think the Commission action plan, the recent one, is probably a good step in this direction. But finally, I think the key question will be how can we foster more member state compliance with, on the one hand, joint commitments, for example, PESCO commitments, but also joint priorities. And I think here, for example, the European Defence Agency has proposed to have a more regular exchange of national defence planners, and that could be one path. But also, Tanja, as you have suggested, for example, a PESCO peer review mechanism to cross-check between the member states whether they actually meet their common commitments. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Nicole, for presenting these super useful recommendations. Also, thank you very much for referencing my own paper. Of course, much welcomed at any point. No, but thank you also for posing some of these existential questions that really the EU has to pose for itself. So to define what kind of strategically autonomous actor it wants to be and to do what, and how to get member states to stick to these commitments that they have signed up to. I certainly personally agree with this need to strengthen the EU's integrated approach, to have it as a overarching guidance of the EU handling this hybridization of threats, as both you and Francois have named it, and the changing power distributions. But enough from me. Now, last but certainly not least, we're going to hear about a cousin of European strategic autonomy, namely open strategic autonomy, and how to make sense of this strategic concept in a world of growing geo-economic competition. So this is a world in which economic links are systematically manipulated for national security purposes, and to try to see how the EU is beefing itself up to react to these trends, while also very much trying to balance this with its liberal mantra. And I certainly can't think of anyone else more suited to tell us about this than my Egmont and otherwise partner in crime, Tobias Gerke, who is working on geoeconomics as a research fellow at the Egmont Institute and is also finishing up his PhD at Ghent University. So Tobias, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tanya. And also, yeah, hello, good afternoon from my side. And thanks also from my side to Niklas, to FIA, to Jacques Delors Institute for hosting this together with us. Like Tanya said, in trade and investment policy, I think the debate is not so settled yet. The specter of protectionism, I think, looms over the whole debate of strategic autonomy. I think there's a lot of EU politicians and policymakers who have been bending backwards to kind of fend off the fear that the EU, that autonomy might lead to protectionism. And there's quite a lot of infighting also, I think, among the Commission in the different directorates, but also among member states, of what exactly is the balance between an open economy and an autonomous economy. And so there's some sort of new creature that emerged out of this, I think. Open strategic autonomy, in a way, it's a compromise among these different forces, but there remains, I think, a lot of suspicion still on the more liberal agents in the EU, what this might mean. And so despite the conceptual suspicion and often also dismissal that autonomy is not something that's in the EU interest, I think it's quite interesting, a bit of an oddity that on the how question, like what have we actually been doing, there's quite some movement. I mean, we've seen so many new policies that have been coming out. There's so many policies and trade and investment policy that are in the pipeline, which are, in fact, autonomous policies. They're unilateral policies often. They're designed to be more assertive in defending EU interests and values. And so I think that's a bit of an interesting oddity. I'll circle back to that. But I want to start a bit from the back. I have 3 quick points to make, a couple of minutes. I want to ask why we've come to this more autonomous EU trade policy. What are these new policies? And there are many, so I'll just run through them. And then, of course, what now? What do we do with this? Maybe the most important question. So on the why question, obviously we all refer to kind of the policy, big policy events, Trump's trade tariffs, sanctions, threat of sanctions, etc. But I do want to, not let us get bogged up into these policy events too much, because there's really, I think, the more structural transformation of the global economy that's been going on for some time. On the one hand, we have, as Tanya said just now, great powers really much more actively trying to manage, trying to control, trying to shape these economic links and these economic capabilities in their national and their strategic benefit. And make no mistake, that's a really big difference, I think, to how the global economy is otherwise built on, the kind of principles of market-led integration, the retreat of the state, market efficiency that are normally structured in the global economy. I think that's quite a big challenge that we see. And secondly, of course, the economic governance framework around this, most importantly, the World Trade Organization, which is, of course, normally sort of the player, the institution that should keep calm on these developments, is, I think, in really serious trouble to regulate these kind of things. It's not just a technical question, okay, the WTO, there's a problem with the appellate body. Trump has sunk or kind of blocked the appellate body, of course. But there are really more serious structural challenges, I think, to international trade governance that we have to face with. One of them is economic, of course, the rise of China's state-led capitalist system, which is heavily built on state-owned enterprises, state subsidies. It's a real challenge that cannot just be sort of brushed over easily. Second, of course, the sort of interface of trade with national security, the rise of China as an innovation, as an economic, as a technological superpower, which increasingly also controls really important critical economic links and assets. And the third one is, of course, a more normative one, rise of authoritarianism and its implications and violations of values, of human rights, that all intersect with international trade in a way that is quite significant. And for the WTO, definitely not saying that we cannot bring these topics into WTO, but it's going to be a big task. There's no easy pickings here. And so it's no surprise, I find, that the EU, but really many global powers, are obviously not putting all their eggs in the same basket, the WTO, but are beefing up sort of the unilateral actions. And they're calling it differently, and they're doing, we call it autonomous strategic autonomy, but I think it's a common trend that is important to observe. Secondly, on the what question, now, as I said, I think we have seen so many policies that it's impossible to go into detail here. For me, it was important to say that to see that the EU's policies are largely, I think, a really reaction to these structural challenges in the global economy. They react on different fronts: on the economic front, on the security front, and on the normative front. And so in my chapter, I try to categorize them into sort of 4 baskets of different policies. One is autonomous policies that try to defend against the economic distortions. This is sort of classical trade policy stuff also that we would normally do in a WTO, but it's not moving ahead. So we're talking about level playing field issues, market access questions. And here the EU has really adopted a range of unilateral instruments to defend itself, to promote its interests, from new trade defense instruments to foreign subsidy instruments to enforcement mechanism, enforcement office, etc. Secondly, we've seen policies that try to defend against economic coercion. So we've seen first a blocking statute as an old legislation was brushed off to defend against American financial sanctions, but the Commission is working on a more broad anti-coercion mechanism, which will be coming out sometime this year, and has published a lot of communications that it wants to work on financial resilience and so forth. Thirdly, we've seen those policies more actively linking trade investment with sustainability and values. Most importantly, I think here the Commission is also working on a due diligence legislation, be able to say, well, we have imports in our market, the kind of imports we get in our market, and we have to make sure that these are in compliance with the kind of values we expect on human rights and environmental protection, most importantly. But of course, also the carbon border adjustment mechanism, it's still under discussion. Of course, we don't know exactly how it will look like, but it's going to be a fundamental impact on EU trade policy, that's for sure. And lastly, there's policies to try to protect, but also to promote critical assets, critical supply chains. Most importantly, of course, the investment screening regulation, which became active this year, but also the EU recently reformed export control regulation. There's, of course, the 5G toolbox, but also on the promotional side, a lot of industrial policy initiatives that span the whole economy, I think. Now, of course, you know, if we look into these policies in more detail, there's lots to discuss. You know, what are they any good, and how do you actually employ them? And that's also the key point. And maybe in my third point, or what now? Because the EU and on trade and investment policy in particular have been pretty good to, I think, to just hammer out legislation. It's obviously EU competence, so there's been so much going on. But in the end, of course, you want to use it all, and how do you use it all? And even though we have a lot of these policies, I think the recent EU's trade strategy that came out just a few weeks ago also really reiterated the point that, well, you know, the open side of open strategic autonomy is really the one that is the more important one. It stresses multilateral reform of the WTO rather than unilateral instruments as the most important aspect to achieving EU trade goals. It stresses trade agreements and not defensive barriers as the ones providing a platform to pursue EU values and interests, it says. So there's obviously this balance. To me, you know, open strategic autonomy remains it's an equation. It's betting, of course, on both engagement and on separation simultaneously. And for that, there's a lot of pressure from certain commentators and actors that this kind of ambivalence of open strategic autonomy does not work. It's kind of paradoxical. I don't agree. I think it's not paradoxical at all. It's in fact the right approach that is crafted here with this concept of open strategic autonomy. It's not so much the approach that's the problem. The problem is, of course, how do we solve that equation correctly? How do you balance these two against each other? And that, it was mentioned already and stressed already, it's essentially, of course, a political decision. You can craft all these concepts as you like, but you have to come to the political questions. Where exactly do we draw the red lines? To what point do we engage? At what point do we then shift maybe to autonomous instruments? Now, there clearly, Niklas mentioned it, this trade-off of interest. We can acknowledge that. It's more a question of what do we do when they actually conflict? When is the EU ready to walk away from one goal in pursuit of another? And these are really the questions also at the heart of, I think, at the heart of the EU-China investment agreement, which is really at the sort of forefront of whether this fits in the EU open strategic autonomy debate or not. I think the Commission, Sabine Weyand of DG Trade, she really, she defended the investment agreement quite rightly. She said, I think, we have this agreement, we engage, but we at the same time, we develop simultaneously these autonomous policies so that if our interests or our values are left unsatisfied by this agreement, we can then bring in or flank our policy, our strategy with these autonomous unilateral policies. And that's right, it's the right approach. But of course, the trick is, of course, when exactly is that threshold reached, right? And that's, I think, a discussion that's missing in the open strategic autonomy debate, where we have to really have a political debate in European parliaments more about the trade-offs and be realistic that there are, of course, trade-offs, and try to come up with some better blueprint of how we adjudicate them. Let me stop here for now to maybe come back on some of these things mentioned by Niklas also before about projection on EU trade. I think that's also an important dimension in this realm. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tobias, and thank you very much to all the speakers. You clearly nailed it. You had very good interventions, since we see that the chat is becoming super active. And I know it's tradition for the moderator to say how she's going to abuse her power and ask the first question. Well, I will try to break with this tradition and show my appreciation for our very active audience by moving straight to the Q&A in the chat, and perhaps I'll try to squeeze in a question later on my own. Now, first, for François, we have Pierre Mirel asking whether from the 8 billion allocated to the EDF, if there's an amount that is pre-allocated for PESCO projects. And I will complement this question by asking, what can we expect from the Commission's working program on the EDF and the funding priorities for this year? Then for Nicole, Pierre Mirel is asking about strategic technological autonomy and whether the obstacles to that are going to be internal first and foremost. So between, he says, Atlanticists and Europeanists, or interventionists and free market supporters, and so on. So if you could please comment on that, and you could also feel free to add not only about the about the internal obstacles to strategic technological autonomy, but also about the external obstacles and how we can balance the interests of other great powers on that debate. And Nicole, I'll pass you another question as well. I'm sure you can handle it, from Leo Michel. Sorry, everyone, if I mispronounced your name. On nuclear deterrence. And I wanted to pass this one on to you because I think it will be interesting to get the German perspective here. So he or she, I'm not sure, says that one sees little, if any, mention of nuclear deterrence in discussions on strategic autonomy. Is it because it is considered off limits by all EU actors? So Nicole, if you could comment on that. Then for Niklas, you're the lucky or unlucky one who's going to get the question from Frédéric Moreau, who always asks the difficult questions. And he points at the several definitions of strategic autonomy, from the original one, Saint-Malo, which you also mentioned, then from the EU Global Strategy, and then open strategic autonomy. So what are we talking about here? He's asking. So then I'm asking you, where do your 3 forms of strategic autonomy fit in this classification that he has provided? And Niklas, I'll also give you another one from Aline Bartenstein on the narrative of strategic autonomy, because I think they're somehow related. So she points at this growing debate and narrative of the Europe that protects, and whether she asks whether the EU narrative has changed from a peace project to a security project, and what does this mean for European values? And finally, for Tobias, I have indeed a question of my own, so maybe I am not breaking with tradition after all. So you said that the emphasis in open strategic autonomy is on the open part. So my question is, how do you marry then the EU's strategy of multilateralism and engagement with a trade policy that is focused very much on resilience and autonomy at home? So what are some concrete examples that showcase how exactly the EU can manage this balance? So first François, then Nicole, then Niklas, Tobias, and then we'll take it for another round. And the audience, please keep them coming. And please also state your affiliation. We'd also like to know who we are addressing. Thank you. And the floor is yours, François.
So thank you, Tanya. On the EDF budget, I mean, no, there's no quota for PESCO project as such. I mean, of course, we are very much attentive to the fact that the EDF priorities and the funded projects should be in line as much as can be, of course, with the capabilities needs as identified, under all the exercises, that derive from the threat analysis. I mean, all the exercises that are actually conducted, on the let's say EAS side of things. So of course we try as much as possible and by design to take into account the priorities as they have been defined in the CDP, but also in the PESCOs. But there is no as such, let's say, a share of the money reserved for PESCO projects. This being said, PESCO projects benefit from, let's say, a bonus as per the EDF rules. So of course this is I would say a kind of positive factor that is taken into account, but there is no basically earmarking of budget for PESCO projects. But when it comes to the priorities which we are defining for the work program of the EDF, and as probably many of you listeners know, we actively engage in that finalization, discussion and finalization of the first annual work program of the EDF for this year. We're trying, of course, to draw on the expertise of as many, let's say, relevant protagonists as can be. So of course, we are relying primarily on the member states. I mean, the identification of priorities and capability needs is very much driven by the assessments made by the member states. So this is pretty much member state driven. But also we are relying, of course, on the expertise of the EES, of the EDA. So and we have, of course, our own expertise and in the house. So we are really blending all sources of information to identify what is the best possible, let's say, structure for the work program to be let's say balanced and meeting the priorities of the member states in terms of the type of capacities that they are in need of. So that's what I can say on this at this stage.
Thank you very much. Then Niklas.
Thank you. Yeah, indeed, you gave me one of the most difficult questions here, but I guess that's what I deserve when I enter all this conceptual debates. I also have to answer those conceptual questions. So what are we talking about when we talk about all these different definitions of strategic autonomy? And isn't that actually a problem? Well, I completely agree. There's not one definition of strategic autonomy. There's a traditional one. There is this global comprehensive view. And at times, this can be a problem. We remember last year, for example, the discussion, or at least through op-eds, the discussion between Kramp-Karrenbauer, the German defense minister, and Macron about whether the EU should be strategic autonomous. Macron had his famous interview where he talked about this very comprehensive idea of strategic autonomy within the technological competition and all the different problems we see in global politics. And at the same time, we had the op-ed by Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, which was very much focused on a very specific element of strategic autonomy, namely the military dimension, and called strategic autonomy an illusion. So instead of talking to each other on this vision and on this problems of the EU, they were talking past each other, and that's of course not always that helpful. I still believe it makes sense to use those concepts because they they lead us to these difficult questions that we want to tackle. They are, first of all, a reflection of how the EU reacts to these international changes. It is happening, and the EU is producing policies in line with that. So it's our duty or our work to kind of think about what these changes mean, and they affect real policy choices. So to look at these concepts is, I think, valuable, and helped us, for example, in structuring this report. And I mean, it's a little bit also maybe not always that fair towards the concept of strategic autonomy to say, well, there are so many different definitions. When we look at international relations studies and think about the discussion of power, what does power mean? I mean, there are books and research seminars filled with the different definitions of power, different dimensions of power, soft power, hard power, smart power. And they I don't say that this is bad, but they help us kind of in analyzing different dimensions of international politics, and that is also where maybe in a constructive way this autonomy debate can lead us. And our 3 dimensions, you added this question, Tanja, how they fit in. Well, you know, this is more related to how we reach strategic autonomy and different strategies, approaches towards reaching strategic autonomy, and not so much about the concept itself. The second one by Aline, great, Aline Bartenstein, yes, old friend from Cologne. Are we talking about securitization of EU foreign policy, right? Or of the is it now a security project? That was the question. And I think indeed, I don't know if I would use the security project as the terminology, but what we have seen, I think, quite clearly in the last 5 years is this turn towards a more geopolitical EU, is this turn towards principled pragmatism. You know, we saw this in the EU global strategy. And it is this turn away from a purely normative, value-based foreign policy. I think this is quite a big shift that we are seeing. And in the report, we described this as well in the diplomacy chapter in a way, that you know, it's often said that it's about promoting values when we talk about strategic autonomy. I think that's also what Charles Michel used in his speeches. The EU wants to promote its values on a global stage, and we need to shape the world according to our values. Well, it's in a way true, but it's less about, you know, thinking about converting others like China, like Russia, to a value model that we identify with when it comes to democracy standards, when it comes to human rights, for example. But it's rather shaping the international context in the way that we protect our own values, that we, for example, institute standards in the technological realm that protect our data privacy to a certain extent. So in that case, I mean, one has to be quite, you know, the EU is actually quite pragmatic. It's not about protecting Chinese citizens from privacy abuses. No, it's about shaping the international context in a way that in the future EU citizens have control over their data and over their data privacy. So it is a very protectionist agenda, and less normative as it was in the future. Also, when we talk about the resilience agenda in the EU's neighborhood, it's similar to that. You know, when we do vaccine politics in the southern neighborhood, well, is it so much? Well, it is, of course, also has humanitarian aspects, but it's also about protecting ourselves from another outbreak of the pandemic and for future mutation of the virus. So there is, I would say, a strong protective turn in EU politics in recent years.
Thank you very much, Niklas. If I can have a small parenthesis, because at the EPRS we also very much look at the EU as a peace actor and what sort of actions it does to promote peace? So this is more to Alina's question. I think it's important to keep in mind that if you keep in mind the dimension of peace, it does translate across the EU's policies. And my reading is that by becoming a stronger security and defense actor, this will give the EU the ability to better and more effectively promote peace through these policies. But this was just a very small parenthesis before passing over to Nicole, and hope that you two can forgive my Niklas versus Nicole confusion. Nicole, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. No problem at all. Yeah, thank you for your questions, which are challenging and interesting. I think on the question of technological autonomy, I mean, luckily we have a chapter in the report on that, so it's not my specialty, but what I would say on that is so there was the question about the external and an internal dimension and how that links to the whole Atlanticist, Europeanist debate. I think there is, when it comes to defense industrial products, a strong, this divide plays an important role as well. There's this question always, to what extent do we buy American products, or to what extent do we build perhaps European competitors? And that's one of the questions with the future combat air system, the FCAS that is being developed by France, Germany and Spain, which of course, will be a competitor with the American counterpart. And I think this still remains an open question. Yeah, to what extent do you buy American products? To what extent do you, join European endeavors? And again, this question also played a role when it came to third country participation in the European Defence Fund or in PESCO. So to what extent are you open to American or British participation? Or to what extent is that a purely European endeavor to really foster European industrial or technological autonomy? So I think this tension is there, definitely plays a role. And there's also an internal dimension to that. So to what extent Europe can become technologically autonomous depends on whether, or to what extent member states are willing to give up some of their own autonomy. And I think this is what we have been seeing in the whole Franco-German debate on FCAS. When you build such a joint project together, do you have to share your own technological expertise? To what extent do you make yourself dependent on other member states when it comes to exporting, for example, this product in the end? So also here you have a tension, an internal tension, aside from, of course, the bigger sort of industrial policy aspects that also François Arbeau alluded to, and which are perhaps not my expertise. So maybe he can come in on that again. On the nuclear deterrence question, why that is not so much part of the discussion, I think you're right. I think it's a bit of a red line, and it's a bit off limits. And I think that's what we could see in this debate between the German defense minister and Macron, that she clearly said, deterrence and nuclear deterrence are too expensive, and it would be an illusion for Europe to move strategic autonomy towards that, and that here clearly we still rely on the Americans. And I think here probably the French vision is a bit different as well. I mean, the spotlight is on France as the only nuclear power after Brexit in the EU, and we had this idea of a nuclear dialogue. As you will remember, Germany's answer to that was not, let's say, highly enthusiastic. And I think this is because, on the one hand, this is about sharing sovereignty on the French side. It's also about sharing quite a lot of money potentially, and it's about crossing an important red line in terms of strategic cultures for countries like Germany, where we have a debate on whether we should get the country out of the NATO's nuclear sharing. And that's only Germany. If you then think about other European countries that are non-aligned and perhaps even more leaning towards the pacifist side, it will be even more difficult. And I asked this question, whether this nuclear deterrence question is part, or is being discussed as part of the strategic compass very early on. And I think the answer was also no. This is too difficult. This is off limits. We're not even starting that discussion.
Thank you, Nicole. And finally, Tobias.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, to follow up what Nicole said on the internal-external divide is, I think, also critical in trade and technological question. I think we mustn't get carried away with the kind of power we have by unilateral setting standards, be it in technology. We all tap ourselves on the back that we have done the GDPR and how great it is for privacy protections and that everyone is copying it around the world. Be that as it may, this is not a universal case, and we should be careful that we not charge ahead too much on when I was speaking on AI regulation and so on. We have to find almost a simultaneous balance, I think, with engaging others, and I'm not only speaking about the Americans here, but others at the same time, to find sort of an external trade and economic strategy that can build these things together. Of course, ideally at the WTO, there are, of course, all these ambitions, but clearly we have to have other outlets where we discuss these things together. Europe, as Niklas said, we have an ambition to set, to regulate, to implement, but I think there's a risk of getting carried away, and we have to get a new kind of foreign economic policy deal. Essentially, I think that's what the new EU trade strategy, I think, didn't really get. I think is how we use foreign trade as a platform for this, because the way we do it now, I think the main instruments being free trade agreements, they're simply not capable of this. They're too narrow, and there's a reason for this, right? The trade people will say, well, we tried more broad, the TTIP with the Americans, which was, more than trade. It was all these regulatory issues, and it didn't work. No one wanted it. It was too broad. So let's keep trade for trade, and other aspects we have to see. But I think that's the wrong approach, because back then also we didn't have all these intersecting issues so much. We didn't have this security aspect so much. We didn't have a Green Deal yet. We didn't have ambitions of digital transforming the whole continent. So it's a new kind of game, and we need a different narrative, I think, of how we engage globally. One that is different than, sort of market integration and only liberalization. We shouldn't throw them overboard, but we have to have a different narrative. I think the 2018 connectivity strategy that was sort of hatched here in Brussels by a few people, and no one actually cared too much about it, it's actually a brilliant idea, because it is a new kind of platform. It's a new kind of way of thinking about Europe in the global economy and what its effort can be. Because it integrates not only trade and investment infrastructure, but it tries to speak to really values, developing values together. And that doesn't mean we first regulate everything in Europe and then say, well, here you go, please everyone adopt the same policies. But really developing a platform where you can discuss about all these issues, a real platform where you can externalize the massive developments of the Green Deal that will come. That will be so fundamental, I think, that if we don't get this into our foreign policy quickly, we won't do ourselves any favor. And that's what unfortunately I think is missing in the current trade and investment debate, which is in its foreign policy. It realizes that there are all these topics about the Green Deal and about carbon and about human rights, etc., and security. But it doesn't really manage to offer a new kind of framework to bring them all together outside of the WTO. Let's also try still at the WTO, but let's be a bit more aggressive maybe in what we offer also to the world.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. I will now take a question from Kalle Hakkason. Sorry for mispronouncing your name, and I will pass it to Nicole. So he speaks about how the debate on strategic autonomies has expanded to other fields such as digitalization, trade, industrial policy, so on, and points at the dichotomous thinking of member states, which leads to them getting stuck in this discussion and seeing it in the light of seeing strategic autonomy in the light of security and defense and the risk of disconnecting the EU from the US. So how to stop thinking about strategic autonomy in this dichotomous thinking, he asks, and would like to add that, for instance, his own country, Sweden, which has taken a more hesitant stance towards the concept, now is becoming more pragmatic and takes a more active position on the discussion on strategic autonomy. And to this, perhaps I can add, because in your chapter, Nicole, you also point at the diverse and often diverging strategic cultures, East, West, North, South. But I myself am starting to notice some shifts across member states, including in my own member state of Romania. So I wonder whether the speakers in general, but I'm addressing this first to you, Nicole, if you identify any shift in the recent years on this concept, particularly as we see Chinese coercion and wolf warrior diplomacy becoming more apparent, since COVID has now kind of given this realpolitik, geopolitics, the spotlight, and put, as Tobias said, our interdependencies to the fore, Joe Biden's election and so on. So do you think that these elements might have shed a more positive light on the idea of European strategic autonomy to more skeptical member states? So perhaps on this, Nicole, you can maybe think of an answer. And then for Francois, I have a question from Björn Knudsen, which is about Norway and how Norway is taking part in both PESCO and the EDF. And he's asking what kind of obstacles exist for third countries, since, as you know, Norway is a full NATO member and affiliated with the EU through the EEA. And to this question, I would add, if I may, how do you, Francois, see the EU's future relationship with the UK as regards participation in PESCO, EDF, military mobility, and so on? So we obviously know that under Theresa May's government, there was political appetite to strike an agreement on this topic, but not under Boris Johnson's government. So we see that there's nothing at the moment covering the future security and defense relationship. So how do you see the appetite in the UK, but also in the EU, since the relationship is rather tense, despite the TCA having passed now? How do you see this appetite, given also the EU-shaped hole, as it was called in the UK's integrated review? Now, I'd let you to think a bit about those two questions. For Tobias, I pass you one from Alexander Conway at the IIEA in Dublin, who's asking whether we should expect a segmented approach to open strategic autonomy, with the EU balancing its openness and autonomy from sector to sector, such as agriculture, energy, or defense, or if this will demand more political engagement. So whether this means that we'll finally get, he says, a more geopolitical commission deciding on the union's national interest. And finally, Niklas, you in the meantime can get ready to answer a question addressed to you specifically from Furkan. It says that it can take years to achieve the necessary capabilities to conduct operations. And there are many definitions indeed of power, but no actor sets the level of ambition to reach this power. Does it make sense to give political or strategic guidance with an appropriate level of a buzzword? Okay. Instead, would it not be more useful for the EU to enhance and acquire its capabilities? So I let you, Niklas, make sense of that question. And then Nicole, I pass you the floor. I hope you had enough time to gather some thoughts from my question.
Thank you very much, Tanya. So there was the question whether it's not problematic to have this dichotomous understanding of strategic autonomy. On the one hand, I'm not sure I completely understood it correctly, but perhaps on the one hand to see it as a kind of narrow security issue, and also to see it as a kind of very much related to the US. And I think as Niklas has said in the beginning, I think we have moved much broader from the narrow security focus, especially since 2019. I mean, drivers were mentioned, the pandemic, but also trade wars and so on and so forth. So I think we have a much broader understanding now, and I think that's also largely understood by all the member states. Nevertheless, the point that I was making is that still the security dimension is a sensitive one, and is the one where we have an agreed goal. And the other part is also, is it only about the US, the strategic autonomy, or is it also perhaps more about other actors? And I think, again, this broadening also means that strategic autonomy is also about other actors. It's also about China. It's also about other emerging powers. It's broader all over. And generally on this point of dichotomy, I think there's also an increasing understanding that it's not either we are strategically autonomous or we are not, but we are moving in different speeds in different fields, and also with regard to different actors. And Tanja, you added whether there is perhaps a more positive attitude towards strategic autonomy. I think, as I said, I think that we have seen a lot of drivers in the past years. And I think generally what we have seen also in the Franco-German dimension is a more pragmatic approach. And this, what we have said today, we need to move to implementation. I think this is something that I think probably the member states can largely agree upon. Also because we have had this joint threat analysis, and I think the member states see there are a lot of threats, a very broad, multifaceted number of threats that we can more or less agree on, and we also know that we don't know what comes in the future and with the next election, so we need to prepare for that. And you see this attitude also among traditional Atlanticist member states. But the question is again now, will that whether the red lines have disappeared, so whether we will find a common approach on Russia, whether we will be able to set joint priorities, considering that there is such a broad range of priorities, and I think the strategic compass here will be a test case. Yeah, I think that was the questions were the questions put to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicole, for the concise answers. It's also because we're kind of running out of time, so I encourage brevity. And now over to Francois.
Thank you. I can confirm that Norway is participating indeed in EDF and in discussions actually on the preparation of the work program of the EDF. So it is indeed as set out by the regulation, fully part of it, and that's an important element. When it comes to the UK, well, as you probably know, there was openness and even appetite, I think, from the EU side for an ambitious, let's say, a future relation on security and defense, which was not met by the equivalent, let's say, appetite by our UK friends. So we are today basically in the kind of default situation of a third country in that respect, but I'm very confident that very soon, as basically the relation between the UK and the EU will further be reflected upon, I will say that we will see things taking up. But if you allow me one more second on this, I think one element that struck me in the report, and which I think is absolutely fundamental, is that strategic autonomy is about managing interdependence, and I think it says it all. Of course, we are in a world that is fully interdependent. Our economies are interdependent. Our security is interdependent. But if we want to be able to manage that interdependence, we have to be more autonomous. The more we will enjoy a capacity of autonomous action, the more we will be able to play our role in managing that interdependence and that potential instability, let's say, of the world. And the more we will be in a position to confidently assert basically our values and ensure our protection. And I think that, and I will stop here, but in that against that backdrop, I think the ambition of the EU, notably via the EDF, is that to be more strategically autonomous and to play better our role at global level, we have to accept a possibly increasing degree of interdependence between the member states. And it's because we will actually accept, build upon that interdependence between the member states, and there are a number of very important subjects to be addressed. Indeed, the more we are depending on each other, the more we open the supply chains, the more we are inclusive, the more we need to address those issues, for instance, of whether we might be dependent on other member states in terms of license for exportation. So, but again, to put it back to the basics, indeed, this is about building an ambition at European level by accepting that we are interdependent and by making the most out of that accepted interdependence. But I will stop here, but I think that's very important, and I was very happy to see that the report actually mentions that question of interdependence to be managed.
Thank you very much. Moving straight on to Niklas now.
Right. Yeah. So I got the question whether it makes sense to give political strategic guidance with a buzzword, or if the EU should rather focus on capabilities. And yeah, I mean, I agree. A buzzword cannot be enough. I mean, if we would stop there, then we really wouldn't do our homework. But and that is why we see so many activities, and Nicole as well as Mr. Bo, they pointed them out: the strategic compass, the European Defence Fund, other working plans and capability plans. So it's not that this concrete work on building up capabilities is not being done, but there's actually a lot going on in that respect. And these buzzwords then come on a higher political level where when it comes to European Council conclusions and so forth. But they operate on a different level. I think I want to underline that I think Francois Bo made a very good point when he said that we need this reflex also of cooperation when it comes to defense industries. I think this will be really a critical thing to see now with the implementation of the European Defence Fund, whether this actually is taking place. Some early experiences from the preparatory action was that there are some cultural differences between, for example, Finnish defense companies and French defense companies in terms of just organizational culture, in terms of size. You know, here they are small and medium sized, and also on what they focus on. I mean, here they are very specific on radio technology and other things. So how we really get Finnish and French and German and Romanian defense companies working together, I think will be a crucial case to see, and it will be interesting to see, and it won't be easy, but of course with the firepower of the EDF there's a certain incentive as well, and over time maybe like a esprit de corps kind of will develop. So now yeah, I think I should stop here because time is over. Thank you. Yeah, Tobias will speak after me, but because I probably don't get the mic anymore, I want to thank everyone from the side of FIA for joining to that and contributing to the seminar. It was a great discussion.
Thank you, Niklas. Very polite indeed. Finally, now, Tobias, with your answer, you have to make it good because our audience has to stay for an extra 2-3 minutes. So the floor is yours.
Yeah. Sorry, I'll keep it short to follow up on this question, whether we should have a segmented approach. And what I understand of this is, yes, certainly. I mean, that's what will develop. I think, you know, the Americans say we have to build higher walls around smaller gardens. And I think that puts it quite neatly, because certain aspects of our economy and the global economy maybe have to be more separated, but there really should be very neatly defined tight spaces around specific emerging technologies, for example. At the same time, however, there is other pressing issues, like, of course, the Green Deal, the global environmental protections. And here, yeah, there won't be, I think we shouldn't build any walls by ourselves, because these kind of autonomous regulations that we might be inclined to get things moving kind of really significant negative implications. I'm not, again, only speaking about the Americans, but on the developing world, they have to have a say in this. We have to have this common discussion and not just, you know, work something here in Brussels because we think our values and worldview is so refined, and then we sort of give it to the world. This kind of generational challenge, I think, we really have to internationalize as soon as possible and not build high walls anytime soon.
Excellent, very well. So with this marks the closing of our seminar today. First, a very, very big thank you to our super active audience for your very good questions. Thanks a lot. And thank you, of course, to our speakers for a very stimulating discussion. So please, everyone, have a look at the report on the FIA website. And I'm informed that this webinar is recorded, so you'll be able to access it later on. Really wishing everyone a very wonderful evening, and goodbye from me from Brussels.